Yeah, good morning or good afternoon. I guess at 11 it's kind of both. On behalf of the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre for Family Violence Research, I want to thank you for joining us today, both in person and online. My name is Stephanie Hunt Kennedy. I'm a professor in the Department of Historical Studies and director of the MMFC. Those of you in person are joining us from UNB and on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Wolastoqey. As a grateful guest on these lands, I want to express my respect and appreciation for the elders and ancestors past, present, and future, and by extension, all guests here today. I want to start off by giving some thank yous. Thank you to the sponsors and colleagues who helped this event take flight. I especially want to thank my colleagues, our Associate Director, Denis Gagnon, and our Administrative Coordinator, Michael Van Tassel, for organizing this event. Thank you to ORS and Dr. David McGee for their support, the Fergusson Foundation, who are members from the foundation are here helping us introduce our guests today, and of course, all of our researchers who are joining us from various locations to share their fascinating research projects. So I'm a disability studies scholar, commitment to access drives a lot of what I do, and I want to extend that practice with you today by making explicit our invitation to get up, move around, stim, knit, do what you need to do to take care of yourself during today's presentations, including leave the presentation if and when you need to. There are accessible and gender-neutral washrooms just down the hall for those of you who may need it. And also related to accessibility, we have simultaneous interpretation in French. And for those of you online, the button's just at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so as I mentioned, today we have the pleasure of the Fergusson Foundation members joining us to introduce our research guests. So I'll turn the mic over to Noreen Bonnell, who's the board secretary for the foundation, who will introduce our first speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. I will say on behalf of the Fergusson Foundation, it's an absolute pleasure to be here working in partnership with the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre for Family Violence Research. We really, really appreciate and enjoy working together. And so today, it is my pleasure, and I could describe it in many other ways, to introduce our two speakers today for this session. This session is on child rights, as we can see, data monitoring, insights on violence against children in New Brunswick. And today our two presenters, the first, one of them is, whether they go in this order or not, I'm not sure, is Christian Whalen. He's a Fredericton-based lawyer, has been for over 30 years. And this 30 years of service has been with the Province of New Brunswick as Legal Counsel to the Human Rights Commission, in the Ombuds Office, Child, Youth and Seniors Advocate as well. He served as a board member with the Canada Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Research Network since 2018. And in September 2024, he was appointed Public Trustee for New Brunswick. In other words, he's very much an advocate for vulnerable people. Mm-hmm. In addition, as an adjunct professor with UNB Law, he teaches and contributes as and here's the list, researcher and public commentator in children's rights, human rights, disability rights, youth justice, privacy, and mental health law and services. That is quite a wonderful and extensive list. So our hopes are high. No pressure. No pressure. Our other presenter today is Katrina Crossman. Katrina is the Designate Director of the Canadian Observatory on the Rights of the Child, and she is a research associate with the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre for Family Violence Research as well. Her work focuses on advancing children's rights through research and partnerships, and these bridge government, community, professional practice, and academia, all of which we know need to be connected together and knowledgeable of what each and the other is doing. She holds a Master of Science in International Development and Humanitarian Emergencies from the London School of Economic and Political Sciences. So with all those to her credit and to his credit, I now welcome Christian and Katrina.
To start, a word of thank you for the kind introductions, and to Stephanie for hosting us here and for the land acknowledgement. I am really wearing my adjunct hat today, but I wanted to thank also Matt Rogers, who, when he was acting director of MMSC, helped obtain the funding for the project that Katrina is leading, and that we want to share with you this morning. So I have a few slides in the presentation. Are the people online able to follow on screen? So I'll speak to the first few slides that are really kind of like the 30,000-foot view of this brand new initiative at UNB and in conjunction with partners at Université de Moncton to establish a Canadian Observatory on the rights of the child. And the seed project for that observatory is a child's rights data monitoring report that was commissioned by GNB, the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. And so this is a continuation of work that New Brunswick has been doing. Both myself and Katrina are longtime associates of Dr. Ziba Vagri at UNBSJ, sort of a leading scholar in Canada and globally in terms of child's rights enforcement and data monitoring. And so we've been working with her for many years in terms of developing a tool as a global standard for child's rights monitoring. And in New Brunswick, myself, at the time that I was at the Child and Youth Advocates Office, we were kind of spearheading those initiatives in Canada. So since 2007, at least from 2007 to 2022, the Advocate was publishing an annual State of the Child report, a Child's Rights Indicator framework. And so it's the hope of the observatory now to pick up that work. And I remember I was the acting advocate for 2 or 3 years when Mr. Richard retired, and Norm Bossy was appointed in 2013. And one of Norm's first questions was, Chris, this work, this like the summer course on the rights of the child and this child's right indicator framework, like, isn't that something that someone in the university should be doing? Is that, does that really belong with the advocate's office? And well, here we are, and we have an opportunity to continue really groundbreaking work. And I think it's New Brunswick's track record on these kind of files that allowed us to attract people like Dr. Vagri. So what I wanted to say about the work of the observatory is that there isn't a project like this elsewhere in Canada. Recently at Sherbrooke, there is another observatory on child's rights that is, since July, taking off, but their focus is really around federating researchers in Quebec with an interest in child welfare. And this observatory is very much on the model of what UNICEF Canada had proposed in 2015 as a model for all of Canada, looking at the best practices globally, where in many jurisdictions around the world, these observatories exist, sometimes in government, sometimes as nonprofits, sometimes embedded within academic institutions, but to do the independent monitoring of government's efforts at respecting children's rights. And so the work here is, taking best practices like this data monitoring reporting process, like the child's right impact assessment that New Brunswick has been doing as part of its policy development function since 2012. We're the only jurisdiction in Canada that requires government officials, when a department is looking at bringing new legislation or amending legislation or regulations or major policy decisions forward to cabinet, to inform that cabinet discussion and deliberation with a child's right impact assessment. So we have good experience in that methodology. Recently, the Department of Justice Canada has developed a child's right impact assessment tool for the federal government. It's not a required process in federal policy development, but it's a recommended best practice. And it's a recommended best practice that is carbon copied from New Brunswick's practice. And so, you know, what we see as the opportunity for UNB, UNM, for New Brunswick, is to take these good practices that we have been honing in terms of child's rights enforcement and general measures of implementation of these foundational human rights obligations to children, and make them more of a common practice right across Canada in other jurisdictions. And of course, to consolidate those practices in New Brunswick. So that's our agenda this morning, is a word about the observatory, why monitor child's rights, and then I'll turn it over to Katrina, who will get into some of the initial insights that we're seeing from the data shared by GNB partners from the fiscal 24-25 year, and zero in on the theme of the presentation in terms of violence to children. So this is a comprehensive tool for measuring child's rights implementation, but we're going to be zeroing in on the impacts that we're seeing in the data from New Brunswick in terms of violence to children, and it is a little bit disturbing. So I mentioned, I think, what I wanted to about the observatory. We have a number of products that we would want to be developing. So this child's rights data monitoring tool is probably the centerpiece of the observatory's work. So we'd like to see an annualized report for New Brunswick, and from there we'd like to see that kind of methodology implemented in other Canadian jurisdictions. So there's some interesting work over the years that has been done in British Columbia. Growing up in BC was an initiative. There are a number of reports from the Representative for Children and Youth and the Public Health Agency of British Columbia in Nova Scotia as well. There's been some interesting child's rights data monitoring efforts by the IWK, but generally it is fairly tangential. And what we're doing with the process in New Brunswick is that we're really building capacity, building off of the methodology recommended in Global Child and recommended by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, who said, if you want to be measuring governments in terms of their accountability to fundamental human rights obligations, you can't be concerned just about the outcomes of the rights holders under the different treaty instruments that you may want to measure, because there's no guarantee that those outcomes are the result of government programs or efforts. So in order to measure accountability to human rights obligations, you have to be concerned about outcomes. You also have to be concerned about the programs and policies of government that are meant to achieve those outcomes. And you have to start with a focus on structural indicators that set the ground rules for those programs and policies to operate within. Then you'll know that there's an intentionality towards improving outcomes for children, say. If you look at the data globally, and UNICEF Canada has been doing great work in terms of providing a Canadian companion report every year to the leaderboards on the state of childhood in the world's most advanced economies. And basically the story there is that Canada has been stuck in the middle for over a decade. In fact, we're dropping from within the top 10 of jurisdictions in terms of healthy childhoods down to the top 20. And on some indicators, we're pretty much near the bottom in terms of, there's about 36, 40 jurisdictions annually that UNICEF monitors amongst the world's wealthiest nations. And Canadians, I think, tend to think that Canada is the best place to raise a family. Canada is the best place in the world to be a child. But the data says otherwise. The data suggests that the Nordic countries, many parts of Europe are really outstripping Canada. And if you look at the measurements year over year from those indicators, what you'll find is that it's not because Canadian children are actually, that their lives are increasingly impoverished or that children are doing less and less well. It's that other governments in other jurisdictions are doing more and better for children, and children in those jurisdictions are closing the gap in ways that Canadian children are not. So we are just being left further and further behind because of a lack of investment in childhood. So UNICEF's reports make those clear, but who's reading UNICEF's reports? Hence the work of the observatory. And so that, the aphorism says, if it's not measured, it doesn't count, right? If we really want to make our commitments to children count, then we measure them. And so that's a cornerstone of what the observatory is proposing to do. The Child's Right Impact Assessment process I mentioned already, but it is really an area where New Brunswick has more experience than any other jurisdiction in Canada. We've seen good things come from this intentional focus on children in policy making, and we'd like to see those benefits applied for Canadian children across the country. So I think there is a huge knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization opportunity around the CREA work that we've been doing. One of the ways in which the observatory would like to do that is to have a dedicated focus on the federal parliament, what's happening in terms of bills before the Senate or before the House of Commons. How can we do good external CREA work with respect to those legislative proposals and kind of build the case for support for CREA? Another aspect of development, and all of these measures are just general measures of implementation as recommended by the Committee on the Rights of the Child to governments all around the world. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most universally ratified human rights treaty in history. Every nation on earth has signed on to this convention. Every nation on earth, save one, has ratified the convention to make it applicable in their jurisdiction. Who knows who hasn't ratified the UNCRC? The grand old US of A. And of course, we know that Donald's going to ratify anything now, don't we? Because of his commitment to EDI and human rights enforcement generally. No, it's too bad that Obama didn't do it. He had 8 years, when he could have done that. And maybe he was saving that as Hillary's legacy piece, but Hillary didn't get her chance. So among these general measures of implementation, the Committee on the Rights of the Child in Geneva has said to Canada and said to governments, you need to do child's rights data monitoring well. If you take these obligations to children seriously, you need to have child's right impact assessment as part of your law development processes. And then there are other kind of more specialized tools like budgets for children. Oftentimes, we see governments announce with great fanfare new investments in education. But So a children's budget process allows a kind of accountability mechanism to look behind those announcements and see, well, is there a shell game going on? Have we, the advocate recently has been calling government out, for some of that grandstanding in terms of their fiscal and budget exercises. So what is a process for, children's budget analysis? Another area where we really want to see progress in New Brunswick, and there has been some work of late, is developing child standards of justice. How do we make justice systems accessible to children and young people? All the years that I worked at the Advocate's Office, I remember, very compelling stories of children frustrated that either through their custody, their parents' custody battle, or in a child protection matter, or in a youth criminal justice proceeding, that they were never heard. That, we talk to people who are remanded or sentenced to NBYC, and we ask them, what did you think of, your legal representation? Were you satisfied with your lawyer services? What lawyer? Who was my lawyer, right? So they're brought through these processes, they're bewildered by these processes, they're not understanding the process, and they really feel that they haven't been heard. Around the world, and particularly in Europe, there's a lot of work that's been done since 2008 in developing child-friendly justice standards. We have started down that path in New Brunswick. We have standards that are developed for the YCJA process, but they're not yet implemented. And the Observatory would like to work with other partners in validating and implementing those standards and adapting those standards to other justice processes in family court, for child protection matters in particular, but also in educational appeals, in administrative hearings, in immigration matters, where children's voices are often not heard. So that's all work of child's rights implementation that the Observatory can support. Our partners at Moncton have been doing great work for many years in terms of child's rights education and training, and we want to see that continue and develop through microcredit and certification programs for different professional associations. So this is all the work of the Observatory. It's not research for the sake of research. It is really applied research and of providing intentional, analytical, child's rights-based approaches and lenses to the work of government, and assisting government in doing the knowledge translation of these best practices from other jurisdictions to Canadian jurisdictions. So that's a lot more than I intended to say. So I'll turn it over right here to Katrina, and she can pick up a little bit about the project that she's leading for EECD and GNB in general, and then dive down into the data on violence to children that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so that was a very comprehensive background and overview. So I think I'm gonna kind of move through the next few slides quickly. I think we understand this now, but I will say in brief, the reason why we're collecting data on children is because children are not like adults. Children require different services. And they have different needs than adults. So we need to highlight children specifically because they're also harder to access. They don't have much room in the public sphere for their voices, which is something else we're working on. But we need to take extra effort to see what's going on with children specifically. And by bringing this to government, we can help them use evidence from which they can make decisions and undertake planning, so that decision making isn't based on opinion or intuition. And then we can hold them to account with those numbers. over time, as we continue to release these reports, we would like to see positive improvements in the numbers. And then we can take government to task and we can let them know what's going well, what's not going well, and where new gaps are emerging. And another important piece here is to try to get data that represents all different groups of children, because children are not homogeneous and different types of children have different needs as well. And we want to make sure that children are getting a fair shot at life. It's not fair if a child is born a certain way that they experience life differently and they have poorer outcomes. So it's important to keep track of that as well, so we can take extra effort for perhaps the most vulnerable of a vulnerable group already. Let's dive into the data now. We just closed our data collection period this week. So it was a 6-week data collection period with government partners in EECD, Justice and Public Safety, Social Development, Health. And we also collected any and every kind of piece of data we could find that was publicly available from Statistics Canada and the New Brunswick Health Council. But these are our very early observations, like our first impressions of the data, because we're just undertaking analysis now. And eventually in the report that we release, we will have recommendations, we will have some explanations, because we're going to talk to government more. We're going to talk, hopefully, if there are frontline workers here today, we'll get to hear from you as well. So yeah, what I'm presenting today is going to be kind of what we're noticing. We're not going to say answers yet, and I'm going to try to elicit some feedback from you. And what we're noticing is not criticizing government. They've been very cooperative with us. They've been collaborating very well. They stuck to our timelines. So this is just to help make New Brunswick a better place for children and to provide our expertise in what we're noticing. So I'm going to situate us broadly with family violence trends for all ages, not just child victims. So this information is from Statistics Canada, and it's showing the trend of the rate of victims of police reported family violence from 2018 to 2023. So the blue line is for New Brunswick, and the tan line is the Canadian average along provinces and territories. So what we can see here is that New Brunswick has consistently higher rates of family violence than the rest of Canada. This is definitely an issue in New Brunswick. We cannot see the child breakdown for these numbers. Statistics Canada only showed the Canadian average when it came to child victims. So they must have the numbers, but it's not publicly available. But what is likely is if the numbers across the board are higher for all ages, it's likely that the rates of child victims are higher in New Brunswick than the rest of Canada. And so not only are the numbers higher, but they're rising, and they're even rising a little bit faster than the rest of Canada. So very pertinent issue. That brings me to the next slide, which is talking specifically about child victims. So we don't have the trend like we did for the last slide, but we do have a snapshot from 2019. Statistics Canada compiled a statistical profile of family violence in Canada. I'm sure some of you are aware of that. So this is at least how we could check in and verify, okay, we're thinking probably there are more child victims than the Canadian average in New Brunswick. If this confirms that, then we can probably go ahead and say that more definitively. So it is confirming that. On the left, we have New Brunswick's numbers, and on the right is the Canadian average. So across the board, the numbers are higher for New Brunswick. As well, you can see, sorry, the font is different here, so the text is coming up weird. The number of female victims is higher than males, and I'm sure this is not a surprise to anyone, but that just highlights, you know, you probably need to take a different approach with female children than male, so we need to know that. So the next slide is based on child protection data that we received from social development. So I'm not going to share the numbers themselves, but just the trends. But before I shared what we found in the numbers, I wanted to put it out to you all. If the rate of family violence against children is increasing in New Brunswick, do we think child protection services, the rate of services being provided to children, is increasing or decreasing? Or I'll just ask, put up your hand if you think the rate of services being provided is increasing. It's decreasing, not at an extremely fast rate. But it's a steady decrease, and this is from the last 3 years. This is consistent with the state of the child reports that were being released. They were noting that that child protection services, the rate being provided was decreasing. So this is a longer trend. And is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? I mean, since we know the rate is increasing, we figure this is probably not good. Did you have? This is the question that Chris and I are going to have to tease out, and we're going to have to talk to social development about. Why is this happening? This is what we see. Why is this happening? There are some reasonable explanations for why perhaps the threshold for intervention changed.
The model of intervention is changing.
Yes.
And so there is an intentionality, I think, in terms of child protection services of being less interventionist and more intent on working with families. So that's this change between a child protection mentality and a child welfare approach that we are working to make children safe by working with the families where they are, as opposed to being very risk averse as government and thinking, oh, let's go in and remove and then we'll figure it out. So that can be part of the picture as well. But it's all for discussion and better understanding. Yeah.
Okay, and so then what follows when children are interacting with the child protection system in unfortunate cases where the family environment is unsafe for them? Removal can occur and they can be placed into foster care or group homes. So we also requested those numbers from social development, and 15% decrease over the last 3 years. It has also slightly decreased, so it's following this new trend that we're seeing. And what would follow after that? What is the obligation of the Department of Social Development for those children who cannot be with their family of origin? Would be adoption, because children have a right to grow up in a stable, loving family environment. And we requested adoption numbers, but they couldn't provide them to us. So I'll touch on that more later. But I also wanted to highlight what we can piece out from children's voices in data. And we're accessing children's voices through the New Brunswick Health Council's Student Wellness and Education Survey, because it's administered to children in schools and they can respond about their experiences, their feelings of belonging, support, how they're being challenged mentally at school, the activities that they're doing, their community involvement. So what we pulled for that we found was related. There are no questions about family violence specifically, was about the sense of family support. So 73% of New Brunswick's children report feeling that their family stands by them in hard times, which is the majority. But what about the 27%? That's a significant number. And they're kind of invisible, so we're not hearing from them. And people working on the front lines probably do. They're probably accessing that 27%. So we really need to hear from them. These are vulnerable children who are receiving services, and they have a right to share about the quality of services that they're receiving and what they're experiencing. So we need to be accountable to the children who are receiving child protection services. Okay, so yeah. those were some highlights from the social development data that we had. I'm going to talk about what we don't have and the implications of that. Okay, so as I was saying, the child protection data is pretty limited. So it had very limited disaggregation. They could provide the numbers for males and females and language of service, Anglophone and Francophone. But we requested data for Indigenous children, racialized, LGBTQ, children with disabilities, and it could not be provided, which was consistent across the board with the government of New Brunswick. And we understand if there are privacy or confidentiality issues, but it's so important to see what's going on with these children because they require more. Children with disabilities, these services need to be accessible for them. Indigenous children need to have culturally appropriate services. We know there's a lot of, discussion and controversy with Indigenous children and the child welfare system. So we need to be tracking that as well. Every group there has particularities that would need to be addressed, and that's why we've requested that data. Okay, so the numbers that we got on the rate of children, and I'm sorry, we're getting so close to the end of time. I'll try to go fast. It was very limited because all we could see or the indicator is the rate of children receiving child protective services. So we don't know what the services are. Are they being referred to counseling? Are they being taken into custody? Is it an investigation? We don't know. And we also don't know why they're entering service. So there are a whole host of reasons why this could be happening. It's not necessarily family violence. They could be witnessing family violence. They could be a victim of neglect or abuse or a whole bunch of other things. So if we want to look specifically at family violence and how it's being addressed in New Brunswick, we can't really with the numbers that we have right now. And then, as I mentioned before, we were told there's no line of sight on adoption. So this is, I guess it's understandable for private or international, but public adoptions, we really want to make sure that government is accountable to their obligations towards children who are entering the alternative care system. I'm going to talk about the broader violence data gaps in New Brunswick. So as I mentioned with that first slide, we don't have publicly available annualized provincial updates for child victims. You can request data from Statistics Canada, of course, but that's not accessible. And people who are interested in this, or regular everyday people, they might, it's a bit gate kept, I would say. So I think if they have it, then just share it, because you must have it if you're sharing the average, and you share it for all ages. And then across the board, this role that the observatory is coming in to fill is to take data across departments and look at it all together holistically in one place. There's some integration happening. There is a shared analytics branch that we're working with, and from our understanding, it's health and social development. So that's good. And we have integrated service delivery, which is also good, but that's on the individual level. What we're talking about is system-wide tracking of children in all facets of their life, because the rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child they're interdependent, they're indivisible. We need to look at it all together. And then there's the lack of child and youth perspectives. So we do have the New Brunswick Health Council survey, but it doesn't have questions about family violence. We're also using data from Statistics Canada's Canadian Health Survey on Children and Youth, and they're collecting data for that right now for the 2025 edition. And they do have questions about family violence, which is great, but we don't know how that's going to get reported. Again, the way the questionnaires look ends up being very different from what we can see in the tables. So we want to highlight it. This is part of children's rights as well. It's going directly to children and hearing from them about their experiences, especially these vulnerable children that are encountering or experiencing family violence. So please use this data in your work, in your funding applications, when the report is published. Use it for your awareness or advocacy campaigns, or your projects, or your programs that you're designing, so that we can all use evidence in our work. Give us feedback on what you're actually seeing in the community to confirm maybe our suspicions about what we're seeing, because this is like a mystery or a story that we're piecing through. And talk to youth, validate the findings, hear from the other 27% if you have access to those kids. And then you can work with us, advocate for disaggregation, since if you're working with children of different identities, you can demonstrate through your experience why we need to keep track of that and what kind of services they require. And join with us to push for regular updates so that we can do this monitoring on a yearly basis. That can help us keep government really accountable and keep track of new initiatives or policies that are being put in place on a year-to-year basis. And give us feedback. Please read the report, okay? And let us know, is this resonating with you? Is this true? What do you think? We want to make sure that we're including community voices as well.